Momentum is building by the day to fully legalize marijuana nationally. 10 states have already done that. More restrictions fall away every election cycle. The federal government barely cares about fighting any of this. You hear less and less about the health risks of marijuana. Does that mean there are no risks? Well, only that many people have an interest in concealing them. Alex Berenson is a former New York Times reporter. He's a great novelist. Now he's the author of an unexpected new book called Tell Your Children: The Truth About Marijuana, Mental Illness, and Violence. He joins us tonight. Mr. Berenson, thank you very much for coming on. I say unexpected because your bio gives no hint of the kind of person who would write this book, but you have. Why did you write it? What did you find?
Well, you can blame my wife because she's a psychiatrist, a forensic psychiatrist, and that means she deals with the criminally mentally ill.
Yes.
A couple of years ago, she said to me, you know, practically every case I see, people were using cannabis at the time they committed these terrible crimes. And I said to her, you know, that sounds like nonsense. That sounds like reefer madness. And she said, you know, maybe you should look at the studies instead of mansplaining me. And I did. And of course, you know, never argue with your wife. She was totally right. It turns out that there is a proven link between cannabis and psychosis.
Really?
There's a very, very strong risk that if you smoke too much when you're in your teens, you're more likely to develop schizophrenia, which is really a devastating mental illness for people. Yeah, awful for not just for the people who suffer, but their families. It destroys families. And furthermore, there's a downstream link between psychosis and violence. So reefer madness basically is real. As a psychiatrist in Australia said to me when I
do you know how,
him.
let me just pause by noting how uncool you sound by saying that.
I know. You know what? I don't care. I have kids. I don't want them to get psychosis. I don't want them to get schizophrenia. I'm going to tell them the truth. And, you know, the reason I wrote this book is so that parents, you know, who have kids who might be using can read this and really understand what the science is. There's a lot of evidence that if you tell kids the truth about, you know, drug use and about addiction and harms, they'll respond.
Let's hold it up right there. So let me understand this correctly. This guy Alex Berenson, who Tucker has on, he has some anecdotal evidence that's secondhand, a story that his wife told him about some, you know, observation casually that she made at work while working with criminally mentally ill people, violent, dangerous people, as he put it. And that marijuana has there's a proven link between marijuana and psychosis, a causal link. And he also said in there that he don't want his kids to become schizophrenic, because, you know, he wants them to know the real dangers of marijuana. So basically, this is an introduction to Alex Berenson and his new campaign to reinvigorate some seriously old reefer madness. The reefer madness that was basically rolled out in the early 1900s. And it's just pure 100% not tried and true science. And when it comes to this guy, he literally didn't bother with any kind of science. He just kind of looked at a report that was made, and he kind of you know, cherry picked the things out of it that supports his case, and he is going full-throated. This connection between, you know, marijuana and schizophrenia, criminally. He's not just talking about schizophrenia either. This is kind of what bothers me about this, is he's sitting here saying that marijuana can cause schizophrenia. Now, and anybody that thinks that that's not what he's saying, come on, give me a break. He just said it. That stuff that I just played you was him saying that. I don't want my kids to get schizophrenia. His book is literally talking about, hey kids, this stuff is dangerous, and here's why. And then it goes on to tell that story that he told that his wife said at the beginning. And this is his, I've heard people say that this is his genesis story for his whole, you know, reefer madness story, that, you know, his his talking point is strictly about this schizophrenia thing. And like I said, I have a problem with the schizophrenia characterization because he's saying he's conflating that with some kind of violence. And he does more of this too. He's talking about how, oh, places where they've legalized marijuana, violence has gone up, murder has gone up, violent crime in general has gone up. He even goes into these anecdotes where he goes into what he calls studies where they show that marijuana use caused, a study of high school students said that students that said that they smoked marijuana were more likely to cause violence than students that drank alcohol, and all kinds of other stuff. So his basic premise is, and supported by supposedly things that he can pull up out of thin air, studies and anecdotal things that his wife told him and stuff. He's telling you that marijuana causes violence. Let's just make it real simple. Alex Berenson says that if you smoke marijuana, you could become psychotic. It causes psychosis. It could cause mental illnesses, including schizophrenia. And that basically, the thing I have, one of the problems that I've seen a lot of people debunking this guy and going into his article and talking about his book and stuff. Nobody ever mentions the two premises that he relies on heavily that would make his case something that would be maybe a reason to maybe look into doing some action on policy or looking into some kind of a public health risk type situation. But there's nothing like that here because, there's not that kind of numbers. So what he relies on is two premises that have never been shown to be true. One is that if you legalize marijuana, more people will use it, like a lot more. Not when this reefer madness hits the airwaves, they're trying to stoke the fears of all the people to freak you out, and especially parents, and in hopes that the most vast amount of people will just believe it, or just maybe believe it might be true. So it's a disinformation campaign that relies on this notion that so many more new people will be smoking weed, but we can stop them from even thinking about it if we tell them that it causes psychosis and makes you turn into a schizophrenic lunatic that wants to go hack up people. This is absolutely insane. I hate to even use that word because this guy's made me rethink the whole, terminology and how serious we take these mental afflictions and how serious we take the diagnosis of these things and how much study that is actually being done in these areas. And apparently it's not enough. Apparently we have certain pills that we know or certain drugs that we know will work for people, and then everything else gets demonized. And then everything else that is barely known about or not studied, we can just make assumptions about. And that's my problem. My problem is, and I've talked about this with people time and time again, all right? You got reefer madness. There's a whole plethora of talking points that you could call that they've done over the years, like smoking weed makes you stupid, smoking weed makes you turn psychotic, smoking weed makes you a drug addict and you're going to go on to harder drugs, smoking weed does this, smoking weed does that. All of these things have been used to demonize weed and keep it illegal and make the public demonize it and be afraid of it. They use it to further marginalize minorities and other people that are, like atheists or whatever. It's like, oh, you couldn't just call someone out because they were an atheist, or you couldn't just arrest the anti-war hippie protester in the 60s. So what'd you do? You made marijuana illegal. Now you can go after those people. Now you can go after the black guy because he's black, not because he's black, but because you caught him with some weed. And it's like, That's the real danger here. The real danger is that this stuff is being used to continue this vilification of this substance and the users of it, this plant. And they get to do it. They get to do it with no studies. They get to do it with no science. They get to tell you anything they want about weed without having any study at all, or having some study that don't really matter. Or what this guy did, he took a study that was honestly looking, and we're going to look at that in a minute, that honestly looked at marijuana as medicine and made a bunch of conclusions about all the literature that they could look at and see. And the conclusion that they came up with is that we don't have enough data to make conclusions on this and that and the other. So if you're going to go out there and say marijuana does this, you can't really say that because we don't have enough studies yet. And I accept that. And basically what I've seen that report as is a blueprint for where areas where we need more study, areas where we have study that looks like promising in a certain direction, that we can do more studies on because we already have a foundation. That's what you're supposed to do with a report like that. You're not supposed to cherry pick it and say, oh, look, this is where we know marijuana causes psychosis and makes people schizophrenic. There's nothing like that in there. So, but we don't get to do that. So when they start the conversation, it's marijuana causes psychosis and schizophrenia. We can't be like, no, we go out there and say marijuana does not cause these things and is actually good treatment for these things. We can tell you how cannabinoids actually can treat schizophrenia. We can't say that because we need they want us to have a mountain of studies that, and all this other stuff. And I say, bring it. Let us do the studies. And the most dangerous thing about all of this is that him and Tucker Carlson do a great job of, further demonizing the plant, further stigmatizing the users, and perpetuating the stigma. And that is what's going to hurt in the long run, because the longer that the public has a reason to think that marijuana is something that could cause real harm, like turn someone schizophrenic and make them go into a psychotic killing frenzy, the longer we're not going to be able to get it out of Schedule 1 and go ahead and study it. Because we need to do the research. If your assertion is that smoking weed can cause you to go out and hack up your family with an axe, well, man, I would want to know that, I've been smoking weed for a couple decades here. I'd want to know if at the end of that, I'm going to grab a chainsaw and start going to town on my family. So we need the studies. We want to know these things, but we shouldn't allow people to start at, oh, if you smoke marijuana, you're gonna get you could get psychosis and schizophrenia. There's never been a link made that can show you how the action of cannabinoids causes any kind of problem in a human's brain or whatever it would take. I'm not a scientist. I'm not a doctor. I'm not sitting here acting like I'm qualified to talk about the efficacy of cannabinoids in this area or that. I'm not that person. I can go to that person and ask them when I need to and find things out. I can type into Google about some things and do some searching through some papers. And what somebody said to me is, well, there is studies either way that say it does cause schizophrenia, and there's studies that say it don't. And I say to that, bullshit. There's no studies at all ever that's shown anything, because there's never been studies allowed to happen. A study, according to the FDA and the people that want you to get your drugs approved, is not what they're doing. They're doing what you call data mining operations. And when you do what Alex Berenson did, there's a name for that too. It's called junk science. When you take a conclusion and then you work from there and gather evidence to support it by doing the data mining, that's called junk science. It doesn't do anybody any good. It's counterproductive. And it's muddying the waters. And it's like They start the video out talking about, oh, you know, whoa, we're going headlong into this legalization and never even looked at what this thing actually is. We've been studying this plant for 5,000 years. As long as people can write things on paper, the paper they wrote it on was hemp. And they studied this, the medicinal values of hemp is back as far as 5,000 years. What do you need to know? What do you need to know? Then they talk about how the schizophrenia has risen in the populations as marijuana has been legalized around, and that's, you can't, and so is violent crimes, by the way, especially in places where they legalize weed. So all these claims are going to get addressed in a second here. I just wanted to open up with my classic, you know, 10-minute long rant about this before we even get into it. And I'm not going to play any more of this video because this is just pure 100% shilling for the book. And it's a crazy book. Like, why would anyone buy this book? Why would anyone in their right mind buy this atrocious book? Let's look at this book. Where is this book? Right here. Tell your children about marijuana, mental illness, and violence. Let's see the description. An eye-opening report from award-winning author from New York Times reporter reveals the link between teenage marijuana use and mental illness. You're going to see a pattern, guys. This is what this guy is about right now. A hidden epidemic of violence caused by the drug. Facts media have ignored as the United States rushes to legalize cannabis. He's acting like there's this nefarious effort to legalize cannabis by a bunch of suited up, like, tobacco type execs. No. Marijuana legalization has been nothing but grassroots movements and activists like me telling you the facts. After Jack Herer put out the book in the 80s, he churned all the stoners into activists. It's not the entrepreneurs that are sitting back in their Wall Street penthouses on Fifth Avenue smoking their, you know, cigars rolled up with $100 bills. That's not the guys that were ever trying to legalize marijuana. In fact, they're still the ones trying not to legalize marijuana. Come on. We got Malcolm Gladwell. Now this guy, he's like a mouthpiece for people that have money and want you to believe their story. Like, he worked for Big Tobacco. He literally shilled for Big Tobacco, writing things that would support Big Tobacco or be, you know, would demonize, like, criminalizing tobacco or trying to do anything that would impede on tobacco sales. So that's the guy, that's who this guy is. And he basically writes this article in the New Yorker as a fluff piece for this other guy. I don't even want to read any of this because it's all the same kind of stuff. But they do go into this gateway theory because at the end of the day, when he's done, when Berenson's done exhaustively, you know, beating this dead horse of schizophrenia and violent psychosis, he always reels back a little bit and then talks about the gateway. We'll see right here. Recreational marijuana is now legal in 9 states. Almost all Americans believe the drug should be legal for medical use. Advocates argue cannabis can help everyone from veterans to cancer sufferers, but legalization has been built on myths. The marijuana arrests fill prisons. They kind of do. They don't fill them, but everybody there seems to have a marijuana charge that helped them be there. Most doctors want to use cannabis as medicine. The ones that don't, well, you know, they get paid really good by Big Pharma. They're Big Pharma reps. That it can somehow stem the opioid epidemic. It can, and it has been proven to. And then it's not just harmless, but beneficial for mental health. I mean, we can start looking into how you can treat people with cannabinoids because we have science that backs that up. We don't have enough science that says smoking weed makes you go berserk and start doing mass shootings or whatever. But it's, for some reason though, every time you look at mass shootings, it seems like the shooter was on some kind of psych med. You know, either at the time or maybe they stopped taking them at the time. Almost no one is in prison for marijuana. He says, this is some of their talking points in this bullet list. Really? Almost no one is in prison for marijuana. All right, when you say prison, that's kind of a specific term. I'd say you need to broaden that a little bit and say locked up or whatever, because county jails, and they're always full of people with marijuana charges. So I don't know what you're talking about. A tiny fraction of doctors write most authorization for medical marijuana, mostly for people who have already used. Who cares? Marijuana use is linked to opiate and cocaine use. Since 2008, the U.S. and Canada is soaring marijuana use and an opioid epidemic. Britain has falling marijuana use and no epidemic. Neither of those are true. None of that whole sentence is true. It's just absurd. Most of all, THC, the chemical in marijuana response to the drug's high, can cause psychotic episodes. Psychotic episodes. Has anybody in my audience ever heard of anyone having a psychotic episode from marijuana? I mean, at the most, you smoke some sativa and it causes you to have a little bit of anxiety, which is not the same as psychotic episode. There's just, nobody has demonstrated this. There's no, if someone's going to have a psychotic episode, which is huge, it's a big thing, and they smoked marijuana sometime in the proximity of that, I guarantee you marijuana did not cause that episode. There's no way, dude. Marijuana is just not that strong. It's not that big of a trigger. Makes you think about things and be like, oh wow, yeah, that's pretty cool. It don't make you think about things and like freak out and start wanting to blow shit up. Psychosis brings violence, and cannabis-linked violence is spreading. What is cannabis-linked violence? That's a new word that he invented because nobody's ever heard of it. Cannabis-linked violence? I mean, am I stupid or something? Because I guess I'm just naive. Because I thought all along cannabis made you relax and mellow when you smoke it. I never heard of this thing where people smoke weed and all of a sudden they're violent or they have psychotic episodes. It's just not really a thing. And I remember earlier when I talked about the premise that he assumes is a thing to base all his reefer madness on. And one of them is that the potency of the marijuana is higher than it was back in the day, so that makes all of the reefer madness even more true, even if it wasn't true before. That's one of the things he said about the gateway theory. He was like, oh, maybe the gateway theory wasn't so true back then, but now that marijuana is so potent, well, it's definitely true now. In the 4 states that first legalized, murders have risen 25% since legalization, even more than the recent national increase. So there is a national increase. I did a little looking into this, and I think I got something to read about that in a minute. But apparently there's a bunch of murders going on across the country. And the 4 states that have legalized, whatever, what are you trying to do? You're trying to say that people are murdering each other? Marijuana is causing people to kill each other, dude? Like, this is so absurd. I don't know, man. I would definitely not recommend this book to my kids. So, yeah, we want the studies, guys. We want the studies. Here's a study. Harvard. Marijuana doesn't cause schizophrenia. This just came out today. And, this is John Grohl. It doesn't seem like a conflict of interest. It's not like this guy's in the marijuana industry in a back of a smoky room sitting here trying to figure out how he can make millions of dollars getting your kids addicted to the wacky weed. He's just a guy doing a study, publishing an article about a study. The results of the current study suggest that having an increased familial morbid risk for schizophrenia may be the underlying basis for schizophrenia in cannabis users and not cannabis use by itself. In other words, you're predisposed to having schizophrenia if it runs in your family. something we've always kind of suspected, and that smoking marijuana isn't, that's not how it starts. According to the researchers, examines both non-psychotic cannabis users and non-cannabis user controls as 2 additional independent samples, enabling the examination of whether the risk for schizophrenia is increased in family members of cannabis users who develop schizophrenia compared with cannabis users who do not, and also whether that morbid risk is similar or different from that in family members of schizophrenia patient who never used cannabis. So this is trying to see, you know, if cannabis has something to do with that link. Like if somebody smoked weed, their kids smoke weed, like that one commercial. I learned it from you, Dad. And it's just like that guy said, you know, if you look into it, there's people that do studies for both sides of the argument, and there's money behind the side of the argument that's going to try to make marijuana look bad. Whether it's John Boehner saying we need to slow roll the federal legalization as long as possible so that he can get his people in position everywhere and get ready for the next phase of the corporate takeover, or somebody that just hates weed and some big pharma, you know, people. Big pharma is the most powerful lobby in the government. Who's to say they're not out there trying to muddy up the water with many studies? So I got a bunch of things to go over to kind of disprove this garbage that Alex Berenson is pushing. And the first thing I want to go over is Ziva Cooper's response to this opinion piece. And like I was saying, Berenson's on a bit of a campaign. Like, he's got the book. He was over there on Tucker. Here's his opinion piece in the New York Times. What advocates of legalizing pot don't want you to know. And then here he is at Mother Jones discrediting that newspaper. And basically anywhere where he's at, the editorial board of that outlet, let me put you on notice right now. You're on notice. You're fake news. You are pushing complete garbage. This is pure propaganda. Now, I know the New York Times don't care, and neither does the Washington Journal, the Wall Street Journal, or the Washington Post. Take your pick. None of those publications, CNN, Fox News, none of them care about whether or not they're pushing reefer madness. It's not going to hurt their bottom line. And the New York Times, let's face it, they've been pushing reefer madness since the 1930s. They haven't stopped. They're usually where it starts. They're usually one of the first outlets, and they're just like right now. They've always had this kind of work environment of where it was more or less a contest to see who could come up with the most slanderous, outrageous reefer madness available. Now the contest has changed. Now the contest is more like who can come up with the most nuanced way to roll out the old reefer madness talking points. And like I keep saying, this reefer madness talking point we have here is a doozy. This one goes back to the 1860s. So here's Ziva Cooper. In response to the recent New York Times editorial on cannabis, and as a committee member on the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine, I kind of take them pretty seriously, because that's the people that are actually at the forefront of all the research. They're the people that actually take a responsible position, the responsible position of actually wanting to know, actually wanting to carry out the research and look into the claims and see what's going on. And then, you know, finally they're the ones that put out this report, which I actually did a video about when it came out a couple years ago. I did a report about it and I called it breaking news. People got mad at me. They said, this isn't breaking news. We know that marijuana is good medicine and it's safe. I know that too, but I just wanted it to be, I wanted to make a headline of it because nobody cared. When this report dropped, nobody cared. Nobody made a big deal out of it. It wasn't on CNN, wasn't in the Washington Post or the Wall Street Journal. Wasn't in the New York Times. It wasn't in an op-ed. No one wrote a book about it on Amazon to tell your kids about it. So, you know, I did my part. But anyway, so remember, Alex Berenson pulls a lot of his generalities out of thin air with this report that they wrote. And she kind of had to come in here and be like, hey, wait a minute, you know, this is, you're using our report for the wrong reason. So anyway, what advocates of legalizing pot don't you want to know? She said, we found, number one, an association between cannabis use and schizophrenia, and two, association between cannabis use and improved cognitive outcomes in individuals with psychotic disorders not mentioned in the editorial. Since the report, we now know that genetic risk for schizophrenia predicts cannabis use, shedding some light on the potential direction of the association between cannabis use and schizophrenia. And there's a study there if you want to go look at that. We also know under placebo-controlled conditions, which is otherwise known as a double-blind study, and that's the one that the FDA likes, and that's the one that people like Berenson should look into more instead of just those data mining operations that I was talking about. So anyway, she said that cannabidiol, or CBD, improves outcomes in patients with schizophrenia when given as an adjunct med, showing that cannabinoids, not necessarily cannabis, improve symptoms. And you can see right here the improvement of symptoms: very much improved, and minimally improved outnumbered the placebo, and then the other way around, the placebo outnumbered it. So that's obviously telling you that there's something to be looked more into there. And here she gives you a link to it. Thank you, Ziva, for that. And I highly recommend anybody that wants to know more about that report to go ahead and to download it. There is an article about it, and I'll try to dig that up and put a link to that in the description as well. Okay, and as we go through this debunking thing, I did find a couple other more, you know, detailed debunkings of it, or whatever you want to call it. So in response to this Wall Street Journal article, this is the Wall Street Journal article. I can't even look at it because apparently I need to, I'm not a member. I don't pay these mainstream outlets to read their stories because they don't need my money. And I don't even know how these old dinosaurs are even being propped up, but they don't need my money. I'm not giving them any money for this garbage. So we had this tweet here, and somebody broke this thread down. I'll leave a link to that too as well. So Alex Gertner, he is he's a doctor, and I mean, I don't really know much about him, but I like what he's doing here. So anyway, he goes ahead and he's talking about this article in the Wall Street Journal, and I'm just going to go through his points, and these are the point by point things that he debunks the claims, or he sees the claims and answers them. So 1, cannabis, like all drugs, can harm people. There's a fair argument to be made that we're not doing enough to regulate recreational cannabis to minimize harms. I'm not sure if I agree with that, but I don't care. That's irrelevant. It does bring up the thing that I agree with, is that we need more research. You know, if you're going to say that, that's fine. Cannabis can harm people. Maybe we should look into that and do some actual studies and see what's going on. That way we can let people know, hey, this is what we found, and you might want to be careful. And it's probably something real specific to certain kinds of cannabis and certain kinds of people. Like first-time users that's why this reefer madness stuff works so good, is because people that never really use cannabis, or maybe even just tried it a couple times and, oh, this ain't for me, they're the ones that are real easy to convince that marijuana can cause psychosis or make you go schizophrenic, because they don't have enough experience with it, And the little bit of experience they did have with it might have been a kind of a little bit of a frightening experience because it was so different and so like eye-opening or whatever. But Alex Berenson's misleading claims about cannabis undermine effort to improve regulation. Check. 2. Mr. Berenson's claim that cannabis causes psychotic disorders like schizophrenia and that increases in cannabis use have led to more mental illness and more violence, since people with psychotic symptoms are more likely to be violent. These claims are unfortunately misleading. 3. Mr. Berenson relies on cherry-picking quotes from the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine report and conflates different types of mental illness to argue that cannabis is causing population-level increases in mental illness. And then, so I mean, with each of these points, there's an article to debunk it or whatever you want to call it. And I'm not going to, that's why I'm going to leave a link to this thread. I'm not going to go through each one of these. But, you know, as generally you see the statement, you can bet that in the article that accompanies it is going to be, you know, some talking points against Berenson's thesis or whatever you want to call it. So number 4, as the NASEM report says, the relationship between cannabis use and cannabis use disorder and psychosis may be multidirectional and complex. Any effort of cannabis on schizophrenia, or any effect of cannabis on schizophrenia risk is likely mediated by genetic factors and amount of use. And then there's the Mother Jones again, this time with probably a little bit better of a look at this. But, you know, does marijuana cause schizophrenia? No. It's just, you know, to try to say that marijuana has some kind of like overall population level increases in schizophrenia is quite, there's absolutely no way you can provide numbers and correlate them in any way, shape, or form that would convince me that that's happening. All right, because the numbers of people with schizophrenia kind of remain the same, as you can see in this chart down here. It just doesn't go up. Like, it's always about the same amount of people in the population. There is no basis for claiming that cannabis use has led to increased population level serious mental illness. These NSDUH data show that cannabis use has increased in recent years in Washington and Colorado, but rates of serious mental illness have not. Now, these increases, I have a problem with that. My problem with these increases are that we know that always around 15% of populations smoke weed. And what you're seeing here is not an increase in actual people that smoke weed, but an increase in people that are willing to say they smoke weed. And sometimes you even see a decrease because people aren't, another way they get numbers like that is, oh, how many people do we have that had to check a box that said I smoked weed? I mean, none of these are real good measures of what's really going on. But anyway, I don't see an explosion of the number of people that smoke weed anywhere where it's ever been legalized. There is no, number 6, there is no basis for claiming that increases in cannabis use have led to increase in violent crime. Mr. Berenson's claim that increase in crime in states that legalize recreational cannabis rely on cherry-picking comparison years. That's always been, you know, one of my highly like frequent rate of videos I have to make is about this whole idea of increases of anything, you know, drugged driving, violent crimes, crime that has to do with weed or whatever. And the one number that always goes down is arrests for weed. That's the one that goes down. Other than that, you can't tie any other thing to weed. Arrest for weed, that's definitely related to weed. Violent crime, murder, car crashes that involve drugs and alcohol, all these things are not, don't have anything to do with weed. So just because they legalized weed and stopped arresting people for smoking it and possessing it, Now all of a sudden, all your statistics that you used to have they're related to weed being legal? How is it possible that when weed wasn't legal, you didn't tie the murder statistics and the violent crime and the breaking and enterings? None of that had anything to do with weed when weed was illegal. All of a sudden you legalize it, and if that goes up, that's because the weed's legal. That doesn't, this is just ridiculous correlation stuff that's been going on in reefer madness the whole way through for hundreds of years. You don't need to trust trend lines from a couple of states. Several studies have examined whether cannabis liberalization and sale increases crime rates. They've all concluded that legalization either has no effect on crime or reduces crime. Especially the one where the crime is weed. That's the one where you can say this definitely has to do with legalizing weed, and it definitely went down because people are definitely not getting arrested for these so-called weed crimes anymore. But they don't ever want to say that. Several of these studies have used econometric techniques to control for pre-law time trends and time invariant state differences. Science Direct, right here. High on Crime, exploring the effects of marijuana dispensaries. And basically what they found is the areas where dispensaries are located, crime seems to go down a little bit over there. Because now you have security guards, cameras, and all that kind of stuff. And it's just, you're less likely to see people. And then there's another one. Basically, there's a lot of studies. We have a lot of studies since legalization has happened. And they don't get a lot of traction in the mainstream media because the sky didn't fall in any of them. They're all basically saying, oh, it's kind of business as usual. Not really anything going on here. 10. What's particularly upsetting is that Mr. Berenson peddles in mental health stigma by suggesting that people with psychotic disorders are violent. That's what I said earlier. I have a big problem with his use of his sitting there talking about psychosis and schizophrenia and violent murder, criminal, whatever the heck else he was saying. That's really bad to characterize people with these mental problems as being violent people. They're just not. By and large, the vast majority of people with mental illnesses do not have a violent tendency, do not have violent outbreaks, or their psychotic episodes are not marked by violent acts and murder and mayhem. A Swedish study estimated people with psychotic disorders accounted for about 5% of violent crime. So out of all the violent crime going on, only about 5% of those were committed by somebody with a psychotic disorder. And it's almost as if you could say that a lot of those are repeated by the same person. Arguments for legalization of cannabis are not based on the claim that cannabis is harmless, but on the fact that cannabis criminalization has augmented the harms of cannabis, especially for communities of color, and continue to do so. So the biggest deal about this whole shebang we know as reefer madness is that it sits there and acts like weed is causing damage and harm to society, and that it could literally cause damage and harm to you, when in fact the thing that's causing damage and harm to society is the criminalization of weed, because that is what separates families. You talk about people that cry about the immigrants that are getting separated from their families at the border and all this other stuff. It's horrible what's going on. But you know what? That's always been going on inside our border. We hear the story time and time again where the mother is treating the son or the kid with epilepsy with out-of-state CBD oil or some kind of THC preparation, and in comes Child Protective Services, the state police. They arrest her, jail for mom, CPS for the kid, family separated. This is you know, you have all these right-wing hater talking points about how, you know, you have welfare moms in the inner city that have kids, that have tons of kids just so they can get more food stamps, and there's no fathers around, and it's just a big mess. Well, why are there no fathers around? Well, it's because of the drug war. And Berenson and others always claim, well, it's not because of marijuana. Well, yeah, it is. Marijuana is enforced in the inner cities and where black people live way differently than it is in Berenson's whatever Upper East Manhattan loft zone he lives in. I don't know what's going on where he comes from, but definitely he don't know shit about how the cops treat people with marijuana and how you get charged and how you get jailed and how you get prisoned. You've heard of 3 strikes laws and mandatory minimums and stuff. Those are designed to make sure that marijuana could get you to prison. There are people in prison. I did the numbers. I crunched it, and it turns out that almost 16% of federal inmates are there for marijuana charges. So don't give me this shit about how there's nobody in prison for marijuana. That's the harm, not marijuana causing psychotic episodes, and that's where the shooting sprees are coming from. No. I mean, if you want to say drugs caused the shooting spree, it would be the antipsychotic drugs. It would be the you know, the anti-anxiety drugs. It'd be the sleep medicine, the insomnia medicine. All right, so 12. This is all very unfortunate because I think there's a good argument to be made that we should be regulating recreational cannabis more carefully. Regulating potency, dose information, and labels are especially promising areas to help people avoid harms from use, in my view. Now, this is this author again. I don't really agree with that. Cannabis is not a drug. It's an herb. THC, you could say that's a drug, maybe, if it's isolated and turned into something that's just THC. But when you're talking about cannabis, it's an herb, and it has its own, if you have a nice balanced plant with the right cannabinoid balance, you shouldn't have to worry about these things. For example, CBD counteracts this psychotic or anxiety or paranoia or whatever you want to call it. CBD actually counter that effect. And THC has been focused on and bred up as CBD has been bred out of the plant. But whatever, man. There's this dosage thing is basically, it's subjective. Like, you know, like, okay, maybe somebody that's not as experienced doesn't take as many puffs on the joint. It's not like, you know, it's like, okay, we know exactly how many milligrams you're getting or any of this. This is all stuff that you're acting like it's a minefield. It's not. And Berenson's acting like people are going to go out and smoke this high potency marijuana and start killing people. It's not happening. You know how I know this? Because we can do an estimation that about 15 million people for sure just smoked a joint within the last 2 hours. And none of them are going to kill anybody. None of them are on some kind of a murder spree. I promise you that. Look at all the weed festivals on 420 across the world. Every one of them reports no arrests for any violent bullshit, except for unless alcohol was involved. And no arrests for a bunch of drug driving. No car crashes from people crashing into each other leaving the event. Same story. No psychotic mass murder sprees. This is people using copious amounts of marijuana at a festival. You can't say that about alcohol festivals or whatever other festivals. Alright, so these arguments are undermined by the misleading and exaggerating claims. Unfortunately, oh yeah, this is the one we just read, sorry. Oh no, unfortunately, much of the reporting has not at all been critical of these claims, though the data to refute these claims is readily available. All these statistics and studies above can be Googled. 14 articles covering Mr. Berenson's claim have not seemed to bother to question the difference between correlation and causation. not looked at the sources he cherry picks, and not examined the data he cites. That's because we're just sick of the same old talking points being rolled out. It's clear to us that Berenson doesn't care about correlation, causation, argument. He will rest his case on anecdotal story his wife told him about some generalization she made observing patients that she deals with, which sounds real, you know, that's, if you're going to make that your genesis of your whole argument or your whole life's work, yeah, you don't give a shit about causation and correlation. You know, you don't care that you have to make causation has to have like physical, you know, action, like THC goes in your brain and it does some crazy thing. Now, you know, he even says that, you know, he's talking to some neuroscientist that told him that, well, my theory is that that's exactly what happens. And, you know, that's cool too, except for that's just a theory. And he uses that. So that's another thing that he uses. So we have done that. I don't know, maybe I just haven't looked at the same debunking or whatever, but I've seen a lot of people do it. And this is just horrible, this Mother Jones piece. So anyway, it's not clear why Mr. Berenson opposes legalization, since it seems his concerns would be best addressed through rescheduling cannabis to allow for more research, regulating the potency of cannabis, and increasing access to treatment for people who experience harm from use. And finally, we have this piece by David Bienenstock over at Leafly. Tell your children to reject Alex Berenson's debunked nonsense. So basically, yeah, here's the thing. He says, my wife is a forensic psychiatrist who specializes in evaluating mentally ill criminals. I'm suspicious of everything Berenson even says, but that's his creation myth. That's his genesis. From cover to cover, Tell Your Children offers up a masterclass in the selective quoting, logical fallacy, strawman arguments, ad hominem attacks, expert shopping, and cherry-picking statistics. For example, to support his claim that cannabis legalization has led to a frightening spike in violent crime, Berenson writes that the first 4 states legalized have a sharp increase in murder and aggravated assault since 2014. Single at New York judged that assertion. Despite Berenson's claim of sharp increases in murder and aggravated assaults since 2014 in Oregon, FBI reports that murder rates there went up a grand total of 1% from 2015 to 16 as compared to nationwide uptick of 7.9%, and then dropped by 11.6% between 2016 and 2017. A significantly steeper drop than the rest of the country. If one insists on posting a tight causal relationship between pot laws and murder rates, one could just as easily argue that Oregon's homicide trajectory has been softened by pot legalization in these years, and at least relative to national trends, saving a number of Oregonians' life. Berenson has pretty clearly been caught purposely leading the readers to a wholly false conclusion. So we wanted a second opinion. For a second opinion, the author of this article went to Dr. Peter Grinspoon, a primary care physician at Massachusetts General Hospital, an instructor at Harvard Medical School, a board member of the advocacy group Doctors for Cannabis Regulation. He's also the son of Lester Grinspoon, pretty much one of the most outspoken doctors for medical marijuana in America. He says the presence of malicious deception at the heart of Tell Your Children means we need to be extra skeptical when evaluating the rest of his book's seemingly outlandish claims, including Berenson's opening anecdote. That's what I just said. I'm like, I don't even believe the story he told about the story his wife told. Quote, I've been working in an inner city clinic in Boston for the last 10 years, and we haven't attributed any violent crimes to cannabis. So I tend to think the author is using this unsubstantiated origin story, which makes no distinction between correlation and causation, to prop up his phony theories, Grinspoon says. Certainly people can decompensate if they have mental illness and use high quantities of cannabis. Grinspoon adds, and I'm sure that in his research he uncovered horrific individual cases of that happening, but you can't attribute crime after crime to cannabis the way his wife does in that fantastical introduction. Speaking of reefer madness, it just so happens that the notorious and widely recirculated 1936 propaganda film was originally titled Tell Your Children. Just like Berenson's book. It's a homage I originally took to be ironic, and then I read deeper and realized that Berenson is literally trying to redeem the war on marijuana in its entirety, going all the way back to Harry Anslinger. In Tell Your Children, he writes, the great villain in the story legalizers tell about prohibition is Harry Anslinger, who served as the head of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, predecessor of the Modern Drug Enforcement Administration, from 1930 to 1962. The marijuana lobby views Anslinger as a racist, anti-cannabis fanatic who exaggerated the drug's danger to convince Congress to prohibit it. They're partly right. Harry Anslinger may have been a racist jerk, but 85 years ago he was right about marijuana. In all seriousness, Berenson's takes on position Anslinger deserves a slap on the wrist for his overt and profoundly harmful racism, but also deserves a pat on the back for recognizing the dangers of cannabis so clearly. Now, a refresher course on Anslinger. So this author has spent 15 years writing about cannabis culture and history. Anslinger's racism and his views on marijuana cannot be so neatly decoupled. America's earliest cannabis users were Mexican immigrants along the southern border in New Orleans ethnically diverse jazz culture. If you happen to irrationally hate both these groups of people and consider them inferior to yourself in every way, then and they're the only people you know who smoke reefer on a regular, then doesn't it just stand to reason that cannabis is dangerous and debasing, and the government should use it as a pretext to launch proxy war against minorities, the poor, and all other sorts of undesirables? Because that was Harry Anslinger in a nutshell. So to wrap this up, I got this review. Now, if you look at Berenson's book on Amazon, what you find is you'll go to the reviews and you'll find some interesting things down here. 60% give it a 5-star rating out of the 35 reviews. And then you look through these reviews and it's just, these are not real people. Or if they are, they're not, they didn't read the book. They don't care about the issue, or they were given some talking points to talk out. Like, for example, look at this one. As I read the comments, shut up, this is pseudoscience and more, I'm appalled at the unwillingness to critically and objectively. No one in these comments said that. So maybe this person's talking about comments somewhere else, but I read all the comments and none of the negative ones said anything like that. So these are people that were just, you know, Amazon filler bots or whatever they were. Here's a good one. I work with homeless folks and at-risk youth and have for over a decade. Drug use is often a common thread among my clients, and I'm always looking for good literature to pass on to their families, so I picked this up a few weeks ago. Having just finished, I'm almost mad that it was published. It's truly just lazy reinvention of Dore with slightly updated statistic, but still no clear scientific data supporting his claims at all. He completely missed the causation versus correlation class that is essential to any scientific writing, and somehow managed to figure that cannabis causes mental illness, even though studies he references over and over again in the book came to a completely different conclusion, making me wonder if he really read his source material at all or just used it because the titles seemed to fit his personal narrative. Cannabis is commonly used by my clients that do not have access or the ability to access mental health services. That's a huge thing right there. Cannabis is commonly used by my clients that do not have access or the ability to access mental health services. There's your link. And the cannabis didn't cause them to get mentally ill. I am not pleased about it, and I have discouraged them from smoking it at all. Smoking kills people. But as a scientist and a social worker, this book isn't accurate or helpful. It depicts cannabis as a drug that can make you lose your mind, but fails to mention the significant role that pre-existing mental illness has on drug abuse. Yes, there is a link, but Mr. Berenson seems to have it backwards. Mentally ill people often abuse drugs as a means to self-medicate. There is no evidence that cannabis causes mental illness, but after reading this book, it seems like Berenson doesn't really have much knowledge or experience with mental illness or drug abuse, so I'm truly confused why he tried to write a book on the subject. I'm truly confused why anybody would let him publish this in their papers. New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Fox News, you know, everybody that touched this guy, your credit just went out the window with a lot of people. I know you don't care. I know you push fake news about war and everything else and you just don't care. But this is seriously, like, you know, intellectually dishonest bullshit. And I think I've talked enough on it. Man, you know, I really hope this is the last time I have to go out here and do this. And it isn't like I debunked this guy or went after him personally or any of that. I mean, I don't know who Alex Berenson is, and I could care less. I mean, I know who this other guy is. This guy here, Malcolm Gladwell, he's a straight up hatchet man. He's the guy that you call when you need some kind of hatchet bullshitry going on. And, you know, like, I don't know why this guy even got brought into it. He got brought into it because he's got 583,000 followers. And somebody had a paycheck and was like, how are we going to get somebody to say something and make it so we can prop up this Berenson shit? That's it, guys. None of it is real. It's all a myth, and it's all in this guy's mind. And he literally said that Reefer Madness is real. Yeah, I do not recommend this book. I highly recommend that everybody tells anybody that they know that this book is total garbage.